you all very much. I'm delighted to be here this evening. I think anyone with a Catholic heart has nothing but respect and admiration for the legacy of Father Nicholas Gruner and his international Fatima apostolate. It's just has done such marvelous work for so many years, trying to promote the full message of Fatima and not being intimidated or inveigled by some in authority in the church who would have them dismiss people's legitimate concerns in this regard. So I think it's a great privilege for me to be here and to address this group tonight. Anyways, we want to talk about the diabolic attack on marriage and the family. Now, there's 2 points I think that I'd like to impart to you particularly, and one is that Our Lady said that Russia would spread her errors throughout the world, and the Holy Father would have much to suffer, and many nations would be annihilated. Not unreasonably and not inaccurately, most people have come to associate the errors of Russia with communism. Again, this is a perfectly reasonable and perfectly, and again, as far as it goes, an accurate estimate. But the errors of Russia do not consist just of communism. 2 attacks on the family are also part of the errors of Russia. One is abortion, and the other is divorce. And they preceded communism in Russia. Though Soviet Russia would legalize abortion and legalize divorce, abortion and divorce preceded the Bolshevik Revolution, preceded the government of Vladimir Lenin, became widespread in the late Tsarist period. So first I want to talk a little bit about that. Before I do, let's just talk about what the consequence, you might say the casualties of communism were. 70 years of communism, 100 years now, if you include also what's going on in the People's Republic of China and in North Korea, in Cuba and elsewhere. 100 years of communism produced perhaps 100 million human casualties, 100 million fatalities. This took many forms. It took forms of mass murder, mass execution. It also took forms of man-made hunger, man-made famine, such as what happened to the Ukrainians, of a kind of class decimation in the kulaks. It took the form of death through forced labor, through the Gulag Archipelago and the other forced labor camps. And of course, it also took the method of ethnic cleansing, the removal of the Volga Germans, the Crimean Tatars, the removal of perhaps 12 million Germans from Eastern Europe after the Second World War. And of course, it also took the form of the combat and collateral casualties of wars of aggression initiated by communist states. The Black Book of Communism, which was written in 1994, 3 years after the fall of the Soviet Union, put the number as 94 million people killed by communist atrocities, by communist war crimes. Now, put this a little bit in perspective. If you look at that other error of Russia, which is abortion, which was widespread in Russia illegally, but widespread before the Bolshevik Revolution, the World Health Organization, the United Nations Fund for Population Activities, and the Guttmacher Institute, which is an affiliate of Planned Parenthood, currently tell us that as of 2021, the number of abortions worldwide is about 73 million. So think about that for a moment in perspective. Communism killed perhaps between 94 and 100 million people through its acts of aggression. In a century. In 1 year, 3/4 of that number were killed through abortion. So what's the more deadly form of the error of Russia here? If you look at, again, those same figures, those same groups, UNFA and WHO and Guttmacher, the number of abortions in perhaps around 2010 worldwide was about 56 million. Around 1995, probably in the mid-40s, 45, 46 million. So since the permissive abortion regime was created in the Western world circa 1965, 1970, it's reasonable to estimate that 2.5 billion people have been killed by abortion. astonishingly evil number. Many times that, 25 times that are actually killed by the deliberate execution and aggressive wars of communism. Abortion was widespread in Russia prior to the Bolshevik Revolution. The Bolsheviks legalized abortion as part of their attempt to destroy the bourgeois family, the traditional family. But it was actually the first Western country where there was a movement to legalize abortion. And incredibly, though perhaps not entirely surprisingly, if we look at modern times, that movement was in the Russian medical profession. And you saw abortion was technically illegal, but really quite widespread and looked askance upon, but not really prosecuted in the period leading up to the Bolshevik Revolution. If you look at the period, say, from prior to 1914, the beginning of the First World War, that 5-year period, by the way, how they measured abortions then was because most hospitalizations of pregnant women came from as a result of abortions in Russia. So they go by, of course, urban areas, because Russia was such a far-flung country and had such a poor infrastructure and a poor medical infrastructure. So the numbers tend to be skewed in favor of urban areas like Moscow and St. Petersburg. But in Moscow, there was a 250% increase in the rate of illegal abortions from 1909 to 1914. And in the same period, there was a much higher rate of illegal abortions, much higher rate of increase in St. Petersburg. So even though the Bolsheviks actually legalized abortion between 1920 and 1921, abortion, again, was an error of Russia. It was the first Western country that had this widespread illegal abortion, and the first Western country to have a movement to legalize abortion in the medical profession, and to some extent also in the legal profession. So again, this is the first error of Russia. But there's also another error of Russia, and that, of course, is divorce. Once again, it was the Bolsheviks who completely legalized divorce. But divorce was quite widespread, actually, in pre-revolutionary Russia, in what, again, an ostensibly Christian state, officially an Orthodox state. As we know, in Western Christendom, divorce began in England. Now, I'm not referring to Henry VIII. He wanted an annulment, a degree of nullity, to put away Catherine of Aragon and marry his mistress, Anne Boleyn. And when he couldn't get it from the Pope, he had his Protestant Archbishop of Canterbury, Thomas Cranmer, deliver it. But actually, in the late 17th century, under Charles II, who died a Catholic, Parliament created a law for the dissolution of marriage. So the first divorce in Western Christendom is in England. But it's very, very rare. It requires an act of Parliament to get a divorce. And it's only really available to the very, very rich. So you see, if you look at divorce statistics in Britain, say in 1860, there's only about 100 divorces a year in Britain that year. By about 1900, the beginning of the 1900s, you have about 500 divorces in England. In Russia, you have, during the same period, about 4,000 annual divorces. The Russian Orthodox Church, and the Orthodox Church generally, but the Russian Orthodox Church particularly, made provision for divorce under certain circumstances. By the way, an important point here is that every time a moral abuse creeps into society, it's always done under the guise of very exceptional circumstances. In the 1930 Lambeth Conference, where the Anglican Communion became the first Protestant denomination to recognize contraception, it was only to be done in the most exceptional circumstances. Couples can, if they already had too many children, if there was some danger to the life and health of the world, they could resort to contraception. Of course, once you admitted the principle that you could practice contraception, then all the barriers, of course, fall away. And this is the same thing that's happened in so many other cases. So the Russian Orthodox Church permitted divorce under some circumstances. Again, by the time of the First World War, you have about 4,000 divorces a year in Russia. And then so it's not really an entirely revolutionary move, is it, for the Soviet government to legalize divorce, because there's already a basis for it socially and legally and morally in society. So, and again, this is, again, the other great deconstruction of the family. The Russian revolutionaries, Lenin, by the way, called for divorce and abortion as early as 1913. So again, about 4 years before the Bolshevik Revolution. But again, it's also an attempt to not only create their regime of radical autonomy, of individual autonomy in sexual matters, and of radical equality, but of course to destroy that most fundamental of what they call bourgeois institutions, the traditional family. So, and of course, it also had the advantage in the case of the Soviets to destroy what they also called an intermediary institution, the family, between the individual and the state, so that the state would have more power, which is why totalitarian societies always try to destroy the family, why they try to turn children into informers against their parents, why they try to indoctrinate children, why they try to control education, why they try to suppress religion, as they want no other influences on the individual but that of the state. Now, if you look at Russia today, by the way, we had, at the height of the abortion regime in America, the abortions have gone down substantially in the U.S. for a variety, I think mostly of demographic reasons rather than legal reasons. But at the height of the abortion regime in America, say in the 1980s, we had 1.5 million abortions a year in the United States. In Russia in the 1960s, a country of a slightly less the population of the U.S., but largely comparable, they didn't have 1.5 million, they had 5.5 million abortions a year. So really appalling number. To this day, Russia remains the country with the highest abortion rate of any country on earth and the highest divorce rate of any country on earth. So these two eras of Russia, abortion and divorce, again preceded communism, and they helped inform communism. And communism exacerbated it and institutionalized it. So again, this was one of these are the eras of Russia, again, are not limited to communism. The other point I'd make is that the eras of communism do not consist solely of attacks on faith and attacks on human life and attacks on human freedom. It's also an attack on the family. Again, they believe that the family represents a threat to the power of the state, which is why they want, again, this kind of regime of radical equality and where there is no barrier between the state and between the state and the individual. There was an Italian communist named Antonio Gramsci, who was one of the founders of the Italian Communist Party. He was a Sardinian, and he became briefly the leader of the Italian Communist Party. He was arrested by Mussolini in 1926, and he died in prison in 1937. But he continued to write while he was in prison, left his so-called prison notebooks, which became a kind of communist work of communist philosophy and also practical organizing. Before he was arrested by Mussolini, he traveled to the Soviet Union, and he made some very interesting observations. He realized that that life under Stalinist Russia, the only way the communists could govern effectively was through terror. And that was because he said there were, again, no intermediate institutions. He said there was no cultural hegemony of these intermediate institutions. It was just the state, and it was a very, again, a kind of it was an undeveloped third world society at the time. In the West, he said there were too many of these institutions, like the church, like the professions, like the media, like the press, that prevented communism from achieving its goals. So the key to creating socialism, and he believed that socialism should replace Christianity, meaning Catholicism, should replace Christianity as a religion, required the infiltration and the expropriation and the eventual control of all of these intermediate institutions. And that became the basis, really, of the kind of cultural Marxism that we see today, that we see from the Frankfurt School and from Marcuse and Horkheimer and others, that are committed to destroying and deconstructing the traditional family and traditional marriage. This could not be carried out, in a way, ironically, in the Soviet Union. When the Communist Party gained control of the state, eventually the state was responsible for social order and for national defense. And one of the great monsters of history, one of the great mass murderers of history, one of the great war criminals and aggressors of history was, of course, Joseph Stalin. But Stalin was lucid enough and rational enough to understand that you could not have a state with loyal and obedient and brave soldiers and with a birth rate capable of sustaining the number of soldiers required to defend the country with the kind of sexual depravity and moral anarchy that communism called for. So Stalin actually tightened laws against abortion, actually banned abortion for 20 years. It was Khrushchev, who we think is the kind of the moderate and the liberal, who actually re-legalized abortion in the Soviet Union in 1955. And of course, Stalin also tightened laws against divorce. What's going on here in the West, in America and the rest of the Western countries, is that the neo-Marxists are not tied to the state in the sense that they don't control the state. Therefore, they have no responsibility for the preservation of social order or for the preservation of national defense, and therefore they're capable of taking their theories of radical sexual autonomy and of complete kind of sexual libertine freedom to its most extreme. And they're seeing this as an attempt to destroy the traditional family and to destroy traditional morality and destroy traditional religion as a means of gaining power and gaining control. So in this regard, the modern neo-Marxists are in some ways more depraved than the classical Bolsheviks, who frowned upon, at least in Stalin's period, frowned upon this level of sexual depravity as something that was inconsistent with the preservation of the state which they had acquired control of. What we're looking at today is something in many ways more insidious and more diabolical. We're seeing again the attempt of the state to gain control of children, whereas the communists, and of course their kind of mirror image, the Nazis, merely wish to indoctrinate children politically. The modern neo-Marxists wish to indoctrinate children not only politically, but spiritually, morally, and sexually. There's no evidence that the old Bolsheviks or the Hitler Youth ever tried to tell a boy that he was a girl or tell a girl that he was a boy. They did not promote homosexuality. Now we've had in Massachusetts, certainly since the 1990s, a governor's commission on gay and lesbian youth and programs called gay-straight alliances, which is to normalize and mainstream homosexuality. We now have not only radical sex education and AIDS education, but now this movement towards transgenderism, where a school teacher can basically, or some school administrator, can tell your child that they're actually not of their biological sex, and they can actually withhold the information from parents. Just recently, just a few weeks ago, we had a bill in the New Hampshire legislature which would prevent teachers or school administrators from doing this to children in New Hampshire. It required teachers and school administrators to share with parents any information about students and their claims of any kind of gender dysphoria. This failed. It was actually vetoed by Governor Sununu. He said there were legal issues involved. There were perhaps civil rights issues involved. So you have a case where the state here is actually, in the United States, an allegedly free country with presumably a Christian majority, which is engaged in more aggression in more insidious aggression, more diabolical aggression against children than you had in the Soviet Union in the 1920s and 30s in the wake of the Bolshevik Revolution. So we're seeing a case again. By the way, school teachers are agents of the government, public school teachers. They're civil servants. So again, agents of the state can tell your child that he's not a boy or not a girl. They can groom them and tell them that homosexuality is acceptable. Under sex education norms, they can tell them that contraception is acceptable and that abortion is acceptable, and obviously that divorce is acceptable. So you see a kind of counter-church, a kind of doppelganger of the Christian church in the public school system, where public schools can proselytize children for this secular and libertinist neo-Marxist religion. So again, this is a much more insidious and much more diabolical attack on the family and on marriage and on the bedrock of Christian society. The great Irish statesman, founding father of Ireland, one of the great Catholic statesmen of the 20th century, wrote in the Irish Constitution of 1937, which Pope Pius XI thought was one of the most profoundly Catholic documents, juridical documents of the 20th century. In the Irish Constitution, it says the rights of the family are inalienable and imprescriptible and are antecedent and superior to the state. Antecedent and superior to the state, before and higher than the state. Well, not only Catholics realize this, but communists realize this. which is why they have to destroy the family and why they have to destroy the traditional religion and all of the institutions which support the family. So again, we now have, again, agents of the state proselytizing your children, with even conservative politicians being reluctant to take action against it. You have a regime of no-fault divorce. Again, divorce was originally, when it was conceived, when it was legalized in countries like Britain and in Russia, it was very exceptional circumstances. But since the 1970s, we've had no-fault divorce, which is again introduced another era of Russia, era of communism. The communist, when the communists legalized divorce in 1920, there were no requirements of guilt or liability on part of any party. It could simply be a matter of, it didn't require mutual assent. Only one of the parties could request it and could be granted within as little as 3 days. So in the 1970s, we've had no-fault divorce. I remember when it was brought in Massachusetts, some Catholic legislators opposed it for reasons that are unclear to me. The Archdiocese of Boston and the Massachusetts Catholic Conference did not oppose it. So now we have almost universal divorce. We have the legalization, basically, of sodomy. Again, when the whole issue of gay rights was, so-called gay rights was brought up, it was intended to end discrimination, they said, in housing and employment. There was no discrimination in housing and employment. It was always a pretext. But since then, we went quickly from so-called gay rights, which meant making homosexuals, practitioners of sodomy, a protected class in civil rights legislation. We went from that to domestic partners, from that to civil unions, and from that to so-called same-sex marriage. And now we have this transgenderism. And along the way, of course, we have attempts to lower the age of consent, and other attempts to actually persecute Christians who will not assent to this, particularly Christian business owners, printers, bakers, photographers, wedding planners, and others. So again, we've seen a complete moral and cultural and social revolution in society that is inspired by Marxism, but also inspired by, again, the classical eras of Russia which preceded a Marxist takeover of their government. And this, you might say, is the devil's final battle, this attempt to destroy the family, which has always been understood to be the building block of society. It's not just an attempt now to seize control of the state or to seize control of the economy through a socialist program of nationalization, but to destroy the family itself and to make children the hostages of the state. So this is the struggle that we are up against, and this is the struggle that we must continue, and the best weapon, of course, is the Most Holy Rosary of the Blessed Virgin Mary. We all remember that the only place the Soviet Union ever voluntarily withdrew from was Austria in May of 1955, after a rosary crusade in which perhaps more than 10% of that country were reciting the rosary on a daily basis. And of course, they withdrew, I think, in October of 1955, and the agreement was signed on or around the 13th of May, 1955. So again, let us have recourse to the rosary to defeat this final and most diabolical assault that is not only on political freedom, not only on the state, not only on the economy, but on the very bedrock of society itself, on the family. So thank you all very much.